Okay. Okay, so this question is asking find the distance between the points -9, 4 and -5, -6. So the first thing is I need to go over what the distance formula is. So the distance formula is the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. And my advice is in math, when you do not understand a concept, when you see a formula, do your best to not memorize the formula, but instead understand where the formula comes from. So I'm not going to use the numbers given because I think they're a little bit harder to intuitively understand what's occurring. So instead, I'm going to say, let's say I give you 1, 1, and 4, 5. And I ask you to find the distance from 1, 1 to 4, 5. Well, one thing you can do is, if you realize that this is 1 and this is 4, right? If I extend this line out, what is the distance from 1 to 4? Well, that is 4 minus 1, which is 3. Okay? Now, what if I ask you what this height is? Well, this height is, remember, this is 1 and this is 5. So the height is 5 minus 1, which is 4. So what have I actually done? What I've done is I've made a triangle, a right triangle, that has a length of 3 here, a length of 4 here, and a length of 5 here. Okay? Note, figure, not drawn to scale. So how do we, well, I'm sorry, how did I know this was 5? Well, what I did was Pythagorean theorem. So if you know that this length is 3 and this is 4, 3 squared plus 4 squared will equal to d squared, which is 9 plus 16 is d squared, or 25 equals d squared, which simply means d is going to be 5 if I take the square root of both sides. So d is 5. So that's how I got the 5. I actually immediately said 5 because this is also known as a triplet, 3, 4, 5. And what essentially a triplet is, if you memorize them, 3, 4, 5 is a very common triplet. If you memorize it, you see a 3 and 4, you instantaneously know the hypotenuse is 5. So that's why I just said 5 real quick, but I proved it. Now, why am I talking about Pythagorean theorem here in relationship to this formula? Well, because what you really did is this is x1 and this is x2. So when you said 4 minus 1, what you really did is x2 minus x1. And by the same argument, the y was the same thing. So y2 minus y1. So when you did Pythagorean theorem here, and you ended up taking the square root, what did you really do? Well, what you really did was you took x2 minus x1, which was 3, you squared it, and then you added y2 minus y1 squared, which is 4, right? And then took the square root of it, and that's how you got your 5. So, in essence, this formula is nothing more than Pythagorean theorem. So, with that being said, you don't really have to memorize it. If you want to memorize it because you just like plugging and chugging, that's fine. What I would do, now I'm going to use these values, is if I don't memorize the formula, all I have to do, and actually let me do this on another page, all I have to do here is draw an accurate picture of what's occurring. So there's my x and y plane. I have -9, 4. So here's -9, 4. -5, -6. Let's put -5, -6 here. And again, all I have to do is draw myself a right triangle. So, let's think about this for a second. If this is 4 and this is -6, what is this length here? Well, this length has to be 4 to 6. 4 to negative 6 is just 10, right? Or 4 minus negative 6, right, which is 10, right? What about horizontally? Well, horizontally, if this is negative 9, this is negative 5, this length is 4, or simply negative 5 minus negative 9 would yield 4. All right. So how do I figure out the orange value, which is the distance? All you have to do is take the 10 plus the 4 and do Pythagorean theorem, just square it to find d squared. So this is 100, this is 16, is d squared. 100 plus 16 is 116, which is equal to d squared. Now, how do you get rid of d squared? All you have to do is take the square root of both sides. And so the square root of 116 is equal to d. Okay? Now, the next move that we're going to want to take here is potentially, can I break down the square root of 116? In other words, can I take out a perfect square root? And my advice is, if it's even, you always want to try 4. Can I factor out a 4? So can I divide 116 by 4? But a 4 goes into 11 2 times, it would be 8. I'm going to get 36 left over, and 4 goes into 36 9 times. In other words, square root of 4 times the square root of 29 is the same thing as square root 116. The square root of 4 is 2, so it's 2 square root 29. I know I can stop with the square root of 29 because it's prime. In other words, the only thing that 29 is divisible by is 1 in itself. And that is going to be my answer. By the way, note, technically, when you take the square root, it is plus or minus, but because we are talking about distance, it's only positive. Okay. So again, my advice is visualize it with a picture, and you don't have to memorize anything. Just draw yourself a right triangle, right, and you're good to go and use Pythagorean theorem. However, I do want to make sure that all methods are covered. So if you prefer, you can maybe write the problem, or at least the points. You can just plug into the distance formula. So if you just want to memorize it, you can. Not a big fan of just memorizing things, because if you just memorize, what ends up happening is you have it memorized for the day of the test, but when you have to use it in subsequent classes, you end up forgetting. Now, one thing that I always tell my students to do is label it x1, y1, x2, y2, so when you substitute in, you don't make a silly mistake. So this is going to be negative 5 minus negative 9 squared plus negative 6 minus 4 squared, which ends up giving you negative becomes a positive, right? So this is just going to become 4 squared plus, this is going to become negative 10 quantity squared. And I want you to realize that, that 10 and 4, right? This makes sense that over here we're getting 10 and 4, right? Because they're the same distance. Now, this says negative 10, but when you square it, it's going to become positive, and that's the beauty of this, because this distance right here, distance, like we said, has to be positive. So if we clean this up, let's see what we end up getting. So this becomes the square root of 4 squared is 16, 10 squared is 100, and we're right back to where we once were. So this is the square root of 116, which we said is going to be square root 4 square root 29, which breaks down to 2 square root 29. And there's our answer. So hopefully now distances make sense, and you're good to go. See you in the next video.